It's over. Time to say it again, Boston. Anything's possible. Banner number 18 has been secured. The Celtics are NBA champions.
Before we get started, I want to congratulate the Boston Celtics on capturing their record 18th NBA championship. I can't wait to watch them raise banner 18 to the rafters at the Garden. Now this makes the 6th different NBA champion in 6 years. The competition in the league is at an all-time high, and it's starting to make people question if the dynasty in the NBA, as we know it, is dead. Now, I think as long as there's great, elite superstar players, there's always a chance for a dynasty. But I think they will be fewer and far between. They'll be shorter-lived and less dominant than in past eras. And this video helps explain why. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. It's time for a little history lesson here. In the late 1950s and early 60s, Bill Russell and the Boston Celtics dominated the NBA. In 13 years, from 1957 to 1969, the Celts won 11 titles, with Russell winning 5 Most Valuable Player awards. They didn't record steals or blocks in the 60s, or Bill might be the all-time blocks leader too. The Defensive Player of the Year award didn't exist until the 1980s, or Bill would probably have 13 trophies to add to his collection as well. The Finals MVP wasn't a thing until '69, otherwise he'd have a bunch of those too. So it's fitting they named the trophy after him. But this run allowed Bill Russell to take his spot as one of the best players of his era, and to go down as one of the greatest players in NBA history, and the greatest winner the league has ever seen. But in the 1960s, the NBA looked a lot different than it would a few decades later. In the 60s, there were only 9 teams in the league, and there were so few superstars with elite skills. In fact, not every team had a superstar. This put teams that did have an elite level player in a completely different stratosphere. And then you had teams like Russell's Celtics, or the newly relocated Los Angeles Lakers, who were teams with more than one superstar player, and it allowed them to dominate the league. Especially since, when we talk about elite athletes, there was only one other big in the league at the time who was as dominant, if not more so, than Russell. Of course, I'm talking about Wilt Chamberlain. When you compare the numbers, on paper, you would probably say Wilt was the better player. He just doesn't have the rings to back it up. He never really had another superstar to run with in his prime. But Wilt put up all-time great numbers. He averaged 50 points per game in a season. He averaged over 20 rebounds per game in 1961. And of course, he has the only 100-point game in NBA history. These are all things that will never be repeated. Besides Kobe's 81-point game, I don't even know if anyone will ever even come close. But there's a bunch of reasons why, and we're going to get to some of them in this video. Now, the NBA knew that 1 or 2 players or teams dominating the sport is bad for the league. So they took steps to make sure the league was more balanced. The first step was league expansion. They wanted more teams, and they wanted to put teams in bigger media markets. The league added teams in cities like Chicago, San Diego, Seattle, and Milwaukee. From 1966 to 1976, the league doubled in size, growing from 9 to 18 teams. Another big step toward creating a more balanced league came in 1976, when the NBA merged with the ABA, increasing the league from 18 to 22 teams. But more importantly, it brought in a wealth of talent that the league needed for its growth to be sustainable. Legends like Julius Erving, George Gervin, and Moses Malone added some much-needed depth to what was considered a dying league. Another big change in the game was the pace of play. The game had slowed down considerably from the frantic pace of the 60s and 70s. In the 60s, teams averaged over 120 possessions a game. That's over 20% more than what we see today. Teams averaged 60 or 70 rebounds per game, whereas today you're lucky to see 70 rebounds between both teams combined. Now, more possessions equal more points, more rebounds, more assists. It's why I've always said any individual statistic from that era has to be taken with a grain of salt. Now, the true effect of the changes from the expansion wouldn't really be felt until the 80s and 90s, as the league became deeper and more competitive all around. There were more superstar-level talents entering the league on a regular basis, and the game of basketball was continuing to evolve. But even with all this depth, one player, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, was able to shine through and make a statement. Not even talking about his NCAA career, in his 20 years in the NBA, Kareem won 6 titles, 6 MVPs, and finished his career as the all-time leading scorer in NBA history. He was arguably more skilled and more talented than either Chamberlain or Russell, but he doesn't have 11 rings or a 100-point game, mainly because he faced a deeper, more balanced, more competitive league. By the mid-80s, even the worst players on some rosters were better than average players on good teams in the 60s. More teams were able to compete. This helped the NBA expand its playoff format in 1984, adding additional spots and eliminating the bye for division winners. This allowed 16 of the 24 teams to make the playoffs, giving teams who would not have had a chance to showcase their ability in the postseason, such as the Chicago Bulls MJ's rookie year, a shot on a higher stage. And along with the influx of talent from the ABA, the late 70s and early 80s saw some legendary players drafted into the league. The league was as popular as ever, and kids were growing up playing basketball, watching and learning from the pros they saw growing up and building off of what they were able to do. We started to see names like Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, and Malone and Stockton enter the league and be able to have an immediate impact. And Magic was able to team up with an older Kareem Abdul-Jabbar for 5 of Kareem's 6 rings. But it was clear that this new generation of talent was far more skilled than the players from the previous era. Now in the 1980s, teams like the Celtics and Lakers still dominated the league, but other teams were able to break through. Teams like the 76ers and Pistons were able to get through and win titles, but it was still pretty rare as the Celtics and Lakers still combined for 8 titles in the decade. Then, as the mid-80s approached, a certain North Carolina Tar Heel was drafted to the Chicago Bulls, and he was ready to change the game. That draft class alone, with guys like MJ, Akeem Olajuwon, Charles Barkley, and John Stockton, pumped more talent into the league than ever existed at one point in the 1960s. And in the 90s, MJ led the Bulls to 6 titles in 8 years, including 2 three-peats. In his 15 seasons in the league, MJ won 10 scoring titles and 5 MVPs. And while the league was certainly deeper and more competitive, there was nobody in the league who could score from the wing like MJ. And because of that, there weren't many teams that were really prepared to stop it. The game was still big man dominant. The other superstars in the league, guys like Olajuwon, Barkley, Ewing, and a very young Shaquille O'Neal, were all bigs. The best wing scorers at the time would never come close to 30 points per game, with few exceptions. And that's part of what makes what MJ did so impressive. Even though MJ was probably far more skilled and talented than guys like Russell and Chamberlain, or even possibly Kareem, he was never going to be able to win 11 titles or score 100 points in a game. The league was too deep. In the 60s, you needed one superstar to dominate. By the early 90s, you needed at least one superstar to even be competitive. And still, the league strived for more parity. In 1984, the league implemented a salary cap, trying to take away some of the advantages enjoyed by big market teams like the Celtics and Lakers, who were still dominating the league. They also expanded free agency, giving players more power to make career decisions. This would have a huge impact on the landscape of the league, as we'll talk about in a little bit. But another big step toward making the league more balanced and competitive was in 1984 when the league implemented the draft lottery. This further gave small market teams a chance to be competitive without having to completely bottom out first. And also in the 1980s, the league took a look at how expansion went initially, and they were pleased with the results, so they decided to add more teams. From 1988 to 1995, the league added almost a quarter of the teams that we have in the league today. And believe it or not, the league knew that, unlike the expansion in the 70s, this next level of expansion would actually hurt them in the short term, but they were willing to risk it for long-term growth. A big part of what made the expansion in the 70s work was that the league was able to absorb the ABA, and in turn get a flow of elite talent to add to the new teams. In fact, 4 ABA teams already came into the league in full, so there was enough talent to fill all the rosters. With the expansion the NBA had planned in the late 80s and early 90s, they weren't going to be able to just take in elite players from another league. But they knew the league was more popular than ever, not just in the States, but overseas as well, as the NBA had started to garner an international audience. They were banking on an uprising of young talent to lead the league into the next generation. They knew it might take a decade or longer to get where they wanted to be, but they felt the risk was going to be worth the reward. And it did hurt the product in the short term. By the mid-90s, as expansion took hold, the level of balance and depth of competition was as low as it had been since the 60s. There wasn't enough talent to fill out rosters. There weren't enough elite-level superstars to go around, and much like the 60s and 70s, not every team had one. In fact, Scottie Pippen, MJ's number 2, would have been a number 1 on at least a dozen other teams in the league. And he proved that in his one full season in his prime without MJ. He led the Bulls to 55 wins, just 2 fewer than the 57 wins they had the year before, with MJ there. Pippen finished 8th in scoring at 22 points per game, led the Bulls in almost every statistical category, and was the best perimeter defender in the league. In fact, that year, Pippen finished number 3 in MVP voting. So if you can lose the best player in the world and only win 2 fewer games, that means one of 2 things. 1, that the Bulls team was stacked even without MJ, or 2, the league was weak and uncompetitive at the time. I'd say it was a little bit of both. But the league was struggling. Giants of the game like Kareem, Magic, and Bird were gone. There wasn't a whole lot of elite young talent reaching their prime outside of Shaq. Older stars past their prime started dominating the league. Karl Malone, for instance, never made a finals or won an MVP in his prime in the 80s and early 90s. At that point, he was getting bullied by some of the better bigs, and his team lost to better teams. But then in the mid-90s, slightly past his prime, he starts winning MVPs and making finals appearances, even though his running mate, Stockton, was just a shell of his former self. Yeah, at that point, the game was watered down. Pace of play plummeted to an all-time low. Parity was out the window as the top teams had all the talent, and with Shaq leaving Orlando and heading out west to the Lakers, it would get worse before it got better. There's a reason they call the mid-90s to the mid-2Ks the NBA dead ball era. It's real. Look it up. Don't let your nostalgia get the best of you. But then by the early to mid-2Ks, the league's gamble was starting to pay off. They would start to see more elite talent enter the league and come into their prime than at any point in NBA history. Shaq had finally come of age, but we were seeing guys like Kobe, Duncan, AI, T-Mac, KG, Jason Kidd, and Paul Pierce all come into their prime. And then that 2003 draft class that brought LeBron, Melo, and D-Wade really sealed the deal. But what really gave the league enough talent was the international invasion. The early 2Ks saw names like Dirk Nowitzki, Steve Nash, Peja Stojakovic, Yao Ming, the Gasol brothers, and Manu and Parker entered the league. But it wasn't just the superstars. It was guys like Leandro Barbosa and Boris Diaw that helped fill out rosters with better options than they would have had from an option of just American players. And by the late 2Ks, this all helped the NBA pull itself out of the dead ball era. The effects of the salary cap, the expansion of free agency, the draft lottery, and decades of expansions had completely altered the landscape of the league. Now, free agency had gone ahead full speed, and players are now making decisions that alter their careers and the history of franchises, as well as the history of the league as a whole. These are moves that would have been unheard of 30 or 40 years ago. Back then, 1 or 2 superstars was usually enough. By the late 2Ks, you needed 3 or 4 future Hall of Famers to have a realistic shot to even make the finals. And it wasn't just from free agency. There were many reasons teams were getting deeper and more talented. There's new scouting and development techniques that have allowed teams to identify and nurture talent more efficiently. The league's investment in youth programs and development leagues have produced a steady stream of skilled players entering the NBA. Training methods and sports science have evolved, contributing to players' improved physical condition and reduced injury rates. Technology such as advanced analytics and wearable devices aid teams in optimizing player performance and recovery. Today's NBA players showcase unparalleled athleticism and versatility. The emphasis on conditioning, nutrition, and advanced training methods has led to athletes who excel in multiple facets of the game. Positions have become less rigid, with players possessing the ability to contribute both offensively and defensively. This versatility enhances team dynamics and strategy. But perhaps the biggest part of the evolution of the game in the last couple decades is the advancement of the three-point shot. Teams now prioritize shooting from beyond the arc, leading to a faster-paced and higher-scoring style of play. The emphasis on three-point shooting has given rise to players like Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, who have redefined the perimeter game. This changed the sport, having it leap from an interior game to a perimeter game. Today's NBA players are expected to possess a broader skill set, including ball handling, playmaking, and defensive abilities. Big men are now often required to shoot from the outside, adding a new dimension to their game. Centers are no longer allowed to stay down low, forced to defend the perimeter, limiting opportunities for blocks and rebounds. The level of skill required to play the game on both ends of the court is as high as it's ever been. This is all without mentioning how some of the defensive rule changes in the early 2Ks made it much easier to game plan for one player or defend the pick and roll more efficiently. But that's another video for another time. Because right now, it's apparent that the league is deeper and more talented than it's ever been. Even the worst players on a roster today are better than an average player from the 90s. The worst teams have more skilled players than the best teams did in the 60s. Now, there's a dozen wing players who could average 30 points a game, sometimes multiple on the same team. There are dudes coming off the bench dropping 40 or getting triple doubles. Now, that was unheard of in the 90s. And that's why today you're not going to see one team win 6 titles in 8 years. It would be impossible to win 10 scoring titles with all the elite scorers in the league. For instance, Jordan won multiple scoring titles, averaging under 30 points per game, where many players in this era have lost multiple scoring titles, averaging over 30. That's part of what makes what guys like LeBron and Curry were able to do in this era so impressive. Even though they were probably far more skilled and talented than guys like Russell, Chamberlain, or Kareem, or even possibly MJ in LeBron's case, neither of them were ever going to be able to dominate the league like their predecessors did. And the league continues to improve. It continues to get deeper and more competitive. The international following has grown to a point where half the players in the MVP race are all international players. It's crazy to think what this league will look like in another 30 years. The league has evolved a lot over the decades. The funny thing is, most people will admit there's a huge gap between the level of skill and talent and depth of competition from the 1960s to the 1990s. But those same people won't admit that 30-year gap is just as large as the gap in the last 30 years, from the 90s to today. But it is. Some people just refuse to admit it. I guess they just prefer that feeling nostalgia. Now let me know what you think about the evolution of the NBA down in the comments. I know if I missed anything or if I got anything wrong, I'm sure you'll let me know. And of course, don't forget to smash that like button and give me a follow. And until next time, get smashed, everyone.